We're going to be talking about the Romanesque period, which begins in about 1000 of the Common Era. And what comes with the Romanesque period is a major change in architecture. Now, one of the things that I want to be a real takeaway for you from this course as a whole is that when there are major architectural changes, that those architectural changes don't happen just because, but rather they are a reflection of some larger sweeping social situation that makes the existing architecture no longer work. So let's remember that for several hundred years, the dominant kind of Christian church that we had in Western Europe was the simple rectangular basilica plan that we learned about back when we studied Santa Sabina. Now, this is going to emerge. We're going to see this in other places emerge as well, where again, it's that simple rectangular plan with an apse, the altar down in the apse, an aisle on either side. This was just such an elegant design that perfectly met the needs of Christians back at the time when Christianity was legalized by Constantine in the 4th century. But some things are going to be happening by the time we get to about the 900s, and certainly by the time we get to 1000, that are going to simply make this building no longer work. And so that's what we are going to be exploring in this lesson. In order for us to get to that, I need to begin by talking to you about a 12-year-old girl who was living in France in the early part of the 4th century. Now, according to some sources, this devout Christian 12-year-old girl whose name we call her now Sainte-Foy, or in English that is Saint Faith. This 12-year-old girl was so devout that when Roman authorities tried to force her to worship the Roman deities, she refused. And because of that refusal, she was tortured and ultimately martyred by being burned, by being grilled to death over a fire. Wow, ouch. So after she was killed, her bones were buried there, her body was buried there in the town in France where she lived. And over time, of course, she was admired as a martyr. And so people came to her and they began to attribute miracles of healing and things like this to her. And so ultimately, she became Sainte-Foy. She was elevated to sainthood. And so this was the situation for several hundred years, until we get to about the year 700. And in about that time, about 120 miles away, there was a Benedictine monastery in the town of Conques in southern France. And one of these monks had a vision in which Sainte Foy appeared to him. She said, I am not happy where I am. I want you to come and get me and bring me back to where you are. This is just so amazing to me. So in what has been referred to as a kind of holy robbery, which was apparently not all that uncommon, these Benedictine monks go and they steal Sainte Foy's remains and they bring them back to Conques. Now, when they bring them back to Conques, they put them into a reliquary. Now, we talked about the term reliquary when we were talking about the Fang people. And we talked about the reliquary figure, the bieri, that sits on top of the bark containers containing the skulls of the ancestors and guards those bones. And so the reliquary of Saint Foy that we are looking at right here also contains bones, part of her skull from Saint Foy. So as time passes, I want us to remember that the kind of church that was existing there at the monastery in Conques was probably very much like those early Christian churches, that simple rectangular basilica plan that we studied with Santa Sabina. So it would have looked very much like this. Again, the simple rectangular plan, the altar down in the apse and an aisle on both sides. But the issue is this. Once they have Saint Foy's relics, her bones, in this church, so many pilgrims start coming and wanting to be in the presence of this church that there are going to be too many people trying to crowd in to see it. And so what this is a reflection of is a movement that is happening all over Europe in the latter part of the first millennium of the Common Era. There becomes this huge belief, this huge obsession among European Christians that there is incredible, tremendous spiritual power in the relics of saints. And that if you can simply come into the presence of a relic of something that was either a body part of a holy person, whether it's a part of a finger, a fingernail, or some bone, or maybe a piece of hair, or something that a holy person used, such as the veil of the Virgin Mary, or a piece of the cross that Jesus was crucified, or part of the crown of thorns, that if you can be in the presence of these physical objects that were associated with these holy people, that these will give you the opportunity to ask the person associated with them for help in this life, and also for help in getting you into heaven. And so, as crowds of people are trying to go and be in the presence of these relics, this type of Christian church simply no longer works. Well, why not? Well, there are several reasons. Well, the first reason is that there is really no practical place to put the relics such that the pilgrims can get in and be close to the relics without interrupting the Mass that is going to be taking place throughout the day. The next problem is that even if you had a place to put the relics, when the Mass is going on, you're going to have a traffic flow problem because there's no way that you can get the pilgrims into the church and to where they can get to the relic without constantly interrupting the Mass. And then another problem is that these pre-existing Christian churches are simply too small to accommodate the flood of pilgrims who are going to want to come in and attend Mass and be in the presence of the relics. So consequently, architects figure out ways to solve these problems. The reason that we're going to be looking at the Church of Sainte-Foy in Conques is that this is the earliest surviving example of a church built specifically to accommodate this flood of pilgrims. And so consequently, what it shows is all of the ways that architects solved those problems that the earlier Christian basilica plans simply could not resolve. So we're looking here at the newly designed, what we are going to refer to as Romanesque church. Let's examine how the architect of Sainte-Foy addressed those problems that kept the pre-existing church from working any longer. So remember that the first problem that existed was that there was no place to keep the relics, such that pilgrims could get in and be close enough to them to feel that personal connection and to be able to make prayers to the person associated with them. So what the architect did is created these little bitty spaces that are called radiating chapels. And so the reliquaries containing the holy stuff used by or parts of saints could be kept in these radiating chapels. The next problem was that we said that this early Christian basilica plan that we have over here doesn't provide any way for the pilgrims to be able to get in and see the relics and then back out without interrupting the Mass. And so what the architect is going to do is going to create a transept with a side entrance or exit here, as well as a walkway that will go around behind the altar and give access to those radiating chapels so that a pilgrim would be able to come in and then go to the radiating chapels, go all the way around, and then come out the other end of the church, or all the way back around to the other transept without ever interrupting the Mass. The next problem that this resolves is that by having these extended transepts, we provide additional space for the pilgrims to be able to attend the Mass, and then also the nave is extended out in this way to provide more space. And so we've elegantly resolved all of those issues that kept this from being a usable plan before. Now, there was another problem that we have not talked about with the early Christian churches, and that is that the early Christian churches with their lovely, big, clear story windows had wooden roofs. Well, now the problem with wooden roofs is that they, with lightning and electrical storms, those wooden roofs burn. And so as we're changing this architecture, what Romanesque churches are largely going to do is they are going to replace the wooden roof with a stone barrel vault, a huge stone barrel vault using that round Roman arch. And this is where we get that term Romanesque, is that they are borrowing the Roman arch, the round Roman arch, for this big barrel vault. Now, that barrel vault solves the problem because it is much more fire resistant, not completely, but it is much more fire resistant, but it also brings in an additional benefit. And that is that it provides superb acoustics for the choirs that come up here. They come up this spiral staircase and make their way up into the second level galleries on either side, where these monk choirs can sing. One group will sing over here, and then they'll be answered by the group singing over here, singing Gregorian chant, and it just echoes throughout the stone barrel vault that is absolutely beautiful. I need for us to be able to identify the different parts of a Romanesque church plan, and then we're going to be using these also as we move on to the Gothic plan. So remember that it started off as a rectangular plan. And so we have added these arms of the cross on either side that are called transepts. Now, the front of the church faces to the west. And so we're going to call the front door, if you will, the west portal. And so the transept over here is the south transept, and on the opposite side is the north transept. We still have the curving area called the apse down here, just as we did in the earlier church. However, instead of the altar being down in the apse, what is going to happen with the Romanesque period is that we're going to move that altar forward to this intersection of the nave and the transept that is called the crossing. Now, since the altar is here, we're going to put great big piers on four corners of this bay, and above the ceiling of the church, we're going to have a huge tower that is going to be like a beacon to the pilgrims approaching from the countryside, saying, "This is where you come." And so we're going to call that area right there the crossing. Now, the walkway that pilgrims are going to be able to go around to get to the radiating chapels that contain the reliquaries, we call that walkway the ambulatory. And so again, we've got a tower on both corners up here on the west end of the church. We also have that spiral staircase tower taking us up to the gallery on both sides. This is what Saint Foy looks like on the inside, and we can see the really major changes that this has brought about. First of all, I want us to recognize that the height of the Romanesque church is much higher. Whereas this might be maybe 3 or 4 stories tall, with Romanesque, the height of that stone barrel vault has gone up to between 5 and 7 stories tall. It would be so impressive for these pilgrims who enter this church. And so while we still have our nave arcade going down, the nave arcade in the Romanesque church has these massive piers. No longer is it just simple columns, but instead we have these massive piers. And those are necessary because the weight of that stone barrel vault is so heavy that we have to have these massive piers underneath to support that weight. I also want you to notice that we have these stone arches that are supporting that barrel vault. These are called transverse arches that stretch from one side of the nave over to the other side of the nave. Now, if we go back and we look at the plan, we can see those transverse arches going from one pier over to the other pier on the other side. Also, the exterior walls are going to have to be really thick and bulky to support the weight of that barrel vault. And we also are going to have on the exterior walls these stacks of stone called solid buttresses that lean against those walls in order to support that heavy stone barrel vault. And so this is what it looks like on the outside. Here are these two towers on the front of the church. Here is that central tower that is over the crossing. This graphic right here helps us to recognize some of the characteristics of Roman architecture. The first thing I want us to remember, because of that heavy stone barrel vault that is behind this round Roman arch, we need to have thick, heavy walls. And so it's going to look really massive and bulky. In addition to this, because they are borrowing those round arches and that round vault from the Roman period, we see round arches as our decorative form all the way around the church. In addition to this, we have what we call solid buttresses. This is an example of the stone extending outward from the wall to serve as a kind of brace to hold up those walls and towers. Another characteristic I want us to remember is that there is virtually no exterior ornamentation except for this really elaborate ornamentation that is over the front portal. Thanks to the City View tool within Google Maps, I'm able to bring us inside the center of the Church of Sainte-Foy in Conques. And so we are standing in the center of the nave, and I want us to realize that our backs are to the altar. We'll turn around and look in that direction in a minute. So right now, we are facing toward the entrance, the front portal of the church on the west end. And I want you to notice, again, the round Roman arches, again, the basis of that word Romanesque. I think it's a really interesting detail to note that this arch that we're looking at right here has alternating colors of stones in the arch, making it have that striped appearance of the striped arches that we saw in the mosque in Cordova. As we move up toward the ceiling, we can see this massive stone barrel vault. We can get a sense of the weight of that barrel vault, some 6 or 7 stories towering up above us. We can also see the photograph is a little bit wonky. It wouldn't look like this in real life, but the transverse arches supporting that barrel vault going from one side of the nave over to the other. I'm going to come back down to floor level, and I'm going to swing around so that we can look up toward the front of the church. I want you to notice there are steps right in front of us and a rope. And that coming up from these steps, what we are looking at right here is the altar. So this is the area right in here that is at the highest elevation that we're seeing right here. This is the crossing. And so if I come up at this angle, we can see 1, 2, 3, 4 humongous piers, and these humongous piers are what are holding up this tower that rises above the roof of the church. We can also see that there are pendentives, just like we talked about in Hagia Sophia, that support that octagonal dome that is up there in the tower. Now, coming back down, I want us to notice that going off to the right in this direction is the south transept. We can just barely see the north transept going over to our left. And then obviously the apse is this curving part that comes around here. And so pilgrims would have been able to come in through the south transept door, would have been able to make a right turn, go through the ambulatory and visit the radiating chapels that are beyond our view, including the view of the Reliquary of Saint Foy herself, and then they would have been able to come out that ambulatory and then down the side aisle. And so one more time, as we swing around and look toward the back of the church, I want us to notice that we can immediately recognize a couple of the things that were problems with Romanesque churches. The first thing is you can see how dark the church is. It is really, really dark because without the ability to put big clear story windows in there, since the roof is so heavy, if we open up those walls with clear story windows, the ceiling will collapse. The result is that the interior of the Romanesque church is going to be very, very dark, and that is a problem. Another big problem is that it requires so much stone that these piers that are holding up these arches to hold up the stone barrel vault have to be so massive that it ends up taking up a lot of the interior space that the architects were actually hoping to create in the larger church. Plus, the expense of building the Romanesque churches was just really extreme because of the quantity of stone that was required. Now, we're going to be talking about Romanesque sculpture in a separate video. And so there we'll be looking at Saint Foy herself in her reliquary, as well as the tympanum of the Last Judgment that is directly on the other side of this doorway.